Introducing yourself after Nicole.
Okay, great, thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jonna Burke, the Global Managing Director of AMEC, the International Association of Measurement and Evaluation of Communications. And I'm so happy to be welcoming you to the Barcelona Principles 3.0 webinar today. We are very fortunate to have wonderful volunteers, all of whom you're going to be seeing here today, talking about the Barcelona Principles 3.0 refresh. The steering committee has spent countless hours talking about this, working with our industry partners, and really going through to make sure that as we look forward to the Barcelona Principles 3.0, they're inclusive of all of the things that are most critical for communications professionals today. And without any further delay, I'm going to turn the time over to Ben Levine.
Thank you, Jonna, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Ben Levine. I'm a AMEC board member and part of this wonderful steering committee who's going to be taking you through the Barcelona Principles today. So before we get into the content, we just want to take a brief moment to introduce everyone you'll be hearing from today. So I'll hand it over to Alex so she can introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Christian. I'm the Assistant Vice President of a PR agency in New York City called Evolve MKD. Very excited to be working with this wonderful team and talking to everyone today.
Hi, I'm Katarina Muehlbauer. I'm a Senior Director at MBooth, also an agency here in New York City. Very excited to be here, so yeah, looking forward to it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Oren Pinello. I'm a Vice President for Data Analytics at MWWPR.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Morio. I'm a Senior Vice President with Ketchum Global Analytics. I'm also an International Board Member for AMEC and the North American Chapter Chair. Happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Emily Burns. I lead the strategic analytics team at MBooth, and I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bailey Roy. I'm Vice President and Head of Analytics at GCI Health. Happy to be here.
Ben, I think you're on mute.
Ben, you're still on mute.
Okay, let's try that again. Hi, everyone. So let's get right into the content that we're going to present for you today.
And you gotta pull up, okay.
Yep, hopefully everyone can see my screen. Sorry about the technical difficulties there. So thank you all for being here today again. We're very excited to share with you the Barcelona Principles 3.0. I'm sure everyone on the phone is very familiar with the Barcelona Principles since they've been in place in the industry since 2010. And I'm sure many of you on the phone are probably wondering why is now the right time to update these principles. And there's two kind of main factors as to why we went through this exercise now. The first of all is that, since the principles were first ratified and adopted in 2010, a lot within the communications and public relations industry has changed. Many of the practices that were relevant then are simply not relevant now. And even some of the updates that were made in 2015 are somewhat less current than they need to be. So in order for the principles to remain the foundation for measurement and evaluation within comms, the principles by which we as professionals in that space live by and apply to our work, we knew that now was the right time to update, refresh the principles, and to think about them in a new light. And it was really coming down to ensure that the principles, as I say, do evolve and grow as the industry grows and changes over time. And we put a lot of thought into ensuring that the new principles were inclusive of all different types of organizations, different types of activity that gets done, from everything from the private sector to the government sector to the public sector to NGOs, really having this recognition that what we do within the communication space is so diverse. We wanted to make sure that the principles were in lockstep with how the landscape was changed and can be applied to whatever it is that we're doing within comms across any type of channel and focused on any type of organizational objective that we're trying to achieve. So that is why we're here today. That's why we updated the principles. I'm actually now going to hand it over to Alex, who's going to introduce our updates to the first principle, and we're really looking forward to having a discussion with you all at the end. So Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Ben. So the first principle, we kind of want to talk about the journey of where we were and where we've gotten today. So we started with importance of goal setting and measurement in 2010. In 2015, we updated it to goal setting and measurement are fundamental to communication and public relations. This year, we are updating it to setting measurable goals is an absolute prerequisite to communication planning, measurement, and evaluation. And there were 3 key changes that we made to this principle. The first is adding measurable goals. And that's so important as we think about goals that maybe we're setting that aren't measurable, being very clear with why the goals that we are setting are attainable and how we are planning on actually measuring those goals. The second update is adding in the term absolute prerequisite. And this is important to both enunciate the importance of goal setting, but also be clear on when we should be doing this. And we should be doing it before, and this is the third update, communication planning, measurement, and evaluation. So with that in mind, we have some updates to the what to do. So the first is goals should start with the change you want to see. So are we aiming to change behaviors within the organization, behaviors within our key audience, behaviors within society at large, being very clear on where we want to see that change. Another key bullet on the what to do section is goals are not KPIs, but KPIs can be component of goals. So often we are defining our goals with ourselves and with our partners through metrics. Goals are not metrics, but metrics are part of goals. So we want to be really clear with that. It's also very important to be holistic across all of your different efforts. So your goal should not be focused on one activity within the communication landscape, but rather encompassing of all of the various activities and tactics that you will then use to ladder up to those goals. And then finally, goals do not have to be static. They can be flexible. And as we know, with everything going on in the world, a lot of our goals have had to shift, or we've had to reconsider what they are. So just keeping in mind that goals can change throughout the year, goals can change throughout the campaign, and they don't need to be rigid.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alex. I will walk you through the principle number 2. So in 2010, we set out saying measuring the effect on outcomes is preferred to measuring outputs. In 2015, we developed that further to say measuring communications outcomes is recommended versus only measuring outputs. And in 2020, so today, we would state that measurement and evaluation should identify outputs, outcomes, and the potential impact. So the key change you can see here is we added in the evaluation part, and we'll get to that in a second. Before we start the measurement and evaluation process, there's always planning. So think about it as with every other good project, we should start with the planning phase. Think about it, bad data in, bad data out. So there are 3 things we have to keep in mind. We first must identify the concrete data sources that we will use. We will then establish which tools and tracking methods will be used. And then also third, what KPIs and or benchmarks will be tracked. So why is that important? We want to make sure that our measurement and evaluation realigns with the goals that Alex just discussed. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are we measuring and evaluating the right KPIs, and do those align with the goals? And will those help us really understand what is working well, what is maybe not working so well, and what should be improved? So in this planning phase, we also have to keep the realities and the context in mind that we're working in. So for example, what tools are available to us? What is the societal context? What is the budget? What is the timeline? All of those things. So answering all those questions in the planning phase will really help and contribute to a successful execution later on. So what should we measure? And that is where the outputs and the outcomes come in, and as already mentioned in the principal title. So the outputs are what is being said, what is being done, what is produced. The tangible and the intangible metrics here are the products that result from the communication work across all the communication channels. And the outcomes, on the other hand, are the change that is being made. So the changes in beliefs, in attitudes, in behaviors, and so on. So once we get to the execution phase, the outputs will always be important, but if they're used as a standalone metric, they should really always be used directionally. However, when you combine those with the outcomes, they can help us understand the holistic picture. So it is always best to combine the outputs with the outcomes and then also add the context to that. So that way you will get a really meaningful, a holistic, and a credible story. So in a very brief summary, we want to measure frequently, we want to measure outputs and outcomes. We want to measure the audience's touch points across the journey and also put the data into context and then interpret the overall meaning to understand why those things are a certain way. And with that, over to Ori.
Thank you, Kat. Now talk about principle 3, which is outcomes and impact should be identified for stakeholders, society, and the organization. I think this principle has really transformed over the years. In 2010, it was the effect on business results can be measured where possible. And I think here the emphasis was really on business, so sales, and really trying to nudge the industry along that you should do this if it's really possible. In 2015, it was expanded to the effect on organizational performance can and should be measured where possible. And two things are happening here. One is that it's recognizing that not all organizations are sales driven and that not all comms campaigns, even if you're a sales driven organization, are about sales. So it's trying to have you think more inclusively about what are the impacts and outcomes that your organization can have. And in 2020, I think that the wording is changed to really make it that it's not a nice to have to look at outcomes and impacts, that you really need to do it, and you need to do it across a variety of stakeholders and society at large and different levels at your organization. Now, what to do? This type of analysis can get pretty jargony pretty fast, so I won't go like too technical into how to do outcomes, but just talk about some more overarching principles. The first thing is that to do this type of work properly, it's all about goal setting. Principle 1, if you don't have your goal set from the outset, it's really hard to do this sort of outcome impact work on the back end as an afterthought. So really important that you're thinking about your organizational outcomes and impacts from the start. The second is that let your research questions, your hypothesis, define your methods. Not everything needs to fit into a certain method. So if your program is about an awareness campaign for public health, maybe the type of analysis you do is pre-post campaign. If it's a larger integrated comms advertising, then maybe you need then something more complicated like a marketing mix or some sort of multi-channel attribution model. If it's something such as you have like a really niche audience, for example, MWW has a client that's product is just for CEOs and their boards. That's super niche. So maybe in that case, focus groups, in-depth interviews are enough to like collect the data that you need. So don't think that this has to always be some really complex model. There is multiple ways to do this type of work. And then the third thing is if you're gonna go through all the effort to do this sort of outcome impact analysis, it should really be more than just for scorekeeping, which is important, especially in this day and age when you're fighting for budgets, and showing your ROI on an organization at multiple levels is important. But if you're going through this work, I think it's really critical that you use it to help actually drive strategic decisions for comms and the organization at all. If you do this type of work properly, you should be able to answer questions like, what was the most effective message? Which spokespeople worked best? Which outlets actually provided the most bang for our buck in terms of getting out our messages? And I'm happy to answer any technical questions afterwards, but now I will leave it to Principle 4.
Hi, everyone. In 2010, when we look at Principle 4, we were really looking at media measurement requires quantity and quality. As we went into 2015, we recognized that that media term was limiting, and so we shifted it to measurement and evaluation requires both qualitative and quantitative methods. So where are we today? Recognizing that communications really needs to be more inclusive and holistic for everything that we do, all the channels we look at, we shifted it to communication measurement and evaluation should include both qualitative and quantitative analysis. So what does that mean? If you think about our job as communicators, it's really messaging and connecting with the right people at the right time and in the right channels. To do that, measuring and evaluating requires tracking and evaluating both quantitative and qualitative measures across channels. Really, we're trying to assess how communications reach and engage with target audiences and stakeholders. If the messaging was communicated via our channels and strategy and approach, and what our target audiences took away as a result. The application of quantitative and qualitative analysis should be specific to the target audience, and that's really important. That you are trying to engage with and be grounded in the goals that you've set for your program. This is necessary for data storytelling that will actually have an impact. There were a few great sessions at the summit yesterday, so hopefully some of you will be able to download those in the future, really emphasizing storytelling and how can people understand the context of your data, and making sure that you have quantitative and qualitative elements is going to help that. So what are some quantitative metrics to think of here? If you're doing a channel analysis, things like impressions or reach among your target audiences, competitive or sector share of voice, engagement with and sharing integrated content across channels. If we're looking at audience research, awareness and recall, message content and relevance, perception, attitude change, expected behavior change. If we're looking at qualitative, really understanding that sentiment or that emotional response from your target audiences, credibility and relevance, message delivery or call to action, endorsements, really kind of going down to providing more context to some of that quantitative data you're finding. And for audience research, looking at ethnographic insights, underlying motivations, rationale, perceptual context, style, language, and impact. Again, those quantitative and qualitative working together, providing that storytelling element. So remember that we're measuring results and progress, not success. So your quality metrics could be negative, positive, or neutral. It is our job to tell the accurate story so we can learn from it, optimize, and report correctly. It should be done consistently over time to look at trends, identify drivers, and context of results. It's really the why behind the what. And that's all about telling a better story. And we need to be thinking about how do we implement this into future communication planning efforts. If you apply the right mix of qual and quant, and those methods to assess results, quality and impact of communications, including but not limited to cross-channel monitoring tools. So these are some of the tools that help us gather all the data out there about how our content is doing. We want to be looking at paid and web analytics tools. We want to look and leverage natural language processing and AI. Something to be aware of here, and that's why it's really important to assess these tools, is potential bias that might be in some of these. There was a great session yesterday from Dr. Ahmed looking at AI and things that we all need to be aware of. Then human-led content analysis for some of those softer measures, such as message delivery or themes. Audience surveys, interviews, or bulletin boards. Remember, all these tools, methods, and approaches should be vetted. Depending on your goal, depending on what audience you're approaching, you need to make sure you have the data that can not only get those metrics, but tell the why and provide that context. So if our goal as communicators is to make sure that the right message is connecting with the right audience at the right time, then powerful measurement and evaluation comes from using multiple data sources, both qualitative and quantitative, aimed to better understand our audience and providing context and storytelling. On to Emily for the next one.
Thanks, Nicole. So Principle 5 is that AVEs are not the value of communication, or as I like to think of it, AVEs, they're still terrible. I will quickly define the concept. AVEs, if you've had the luxury of forgetting, are ad value equivalency metrics. So they attempt to represent the value of earned media coverage or communications in terms of its equivalent cost should the same exposure be purchased as a paid media advertisement. The problem with AVEs is that they are based on a whole cluster of bad assumptions that I won't list in too much detail, but the biggest and worst of these is that they really do a fundamental disservice to communications by assuming that all impressions are of equal value, that the impact that somebody is going to get from an impression of what might be a long form piece of written content written by somebody with third-party credibility, that impression is going to be comparable to the impact of a single impression of a digital banner ad, which is pretty absurd just on its face. But in this way, AVEs do really dramatically devalue everything it is that communications does best. So don't use them to measure your communications. Some of you may be nodding along at this or even rolling your eyes and asking, why are we still talking about AVEs in 2020? This has been solved. And really the good news is in the US, AVEs have all but disappeared from the scene, but we're not quite out of the woods. They are an incredibly tempting metric to use, particularly for large global art organizations, because they pretend to offer this really simple single source of truth to measure all communications performance in a standard way. And so they are actually still very widely in use in some regions around the globe, Asia being one example. So that's all a lot about what we should not be doing. When it comes to measurement, what should we do instead? We certainly have to measure something. So what we would advocate is a much more thoughtful approach to measuring communications, really paying attention to those principles that Nicole just took us through in Principle 4, which include things like, using metrics that are direct and transparent as possible. So not relying on complex and opaque back-end calculations. And of course, really important to find a way to account for quality. Just as a banner ad impression is not the equivalent to the impact of someone sitting and reading an entire article, likewise, we need to account for key message inclusion in target reach or audience quality and other quality factors. So that wraps up Principle 5, and I will pass the mic to Bailey for Principle 6.
Great, thanks, Emily. So Principle 6, we've come a long way since 2010. How it reads today is that holistic communication measurement and evaluation includes all relevant online and offline channels. And you can see the original principle was actually social media can and should be measured. So we've moved away from recognizing that social media should be part of the mix. That is now table stakes. And you can see now that all channels should be considered depending on your campaign and your program. So to break this down a little further, if you go to the next. So when we break this down into some of the channels you should consider, thinking about, and these are just a few examples of what you could consider depending on your campaign and what you're launching. So a few that are obvious, so online and offline earned media content. This could be, online news or offline news. Owned social channels, this is a big one. That could be Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, depending on your market. Owned websites and microsites, organic and paid search, and of course, paid advertising, surveys, events, influencers, both paid and earned, email marketing, and even e-commerce and sales. And so you can see the list could go further than this. But what you need to do here, and what this principle is meant to describe, is that you should be looking at the channels and the touch points across your audience and customer journey. And so when you map that out and you see the different, and that even when your own experience, you're touching all these channels, we should also be measuring those. It's super important to define clear goals and outcomes across those channels, and evaluate those channels both from a quality and quantity perspective beyond just vanity metrics like likes and impressions. And lastly, just making sure you understand what you can get from each channel from a privacy perspective. So of course, some of these channels make it a little bit more difficult to get back-end data, such as websites, especially with GDPR and privacy. And so before you start any program, making sure that you understand what you can get, what you can't get, and making sure you can get as much as possible to, again, get that holistic communication measurement and evaluation.
Great, thank you, Bailey. So the last principle is all about ethics, which is familiar for the AMEC members who were able to attend Jim McNamara's keynote during the conference. But Principle 7 started with transparency and replicability are paramount to sound measurement. In 2015, it got an update to measurement and evaluation should be transparent, consistent, and valid. Today, it reads, communication, measurement, and evaluation are rooted in integrity and transparency to drive learning and insight. And there's a few key changes to Principle 7. The first is that rooted word, and the aim is to enunciate that integrity and transparency are foundational for measurement and evaluation. There's no getting around it. And then it also talks about the intent of that integrity and transparency to drive learning and insights. So with that, the what to do. So we really are the experts for ourselves, for our peers, and also for our clients. And so it's up to us to understand the latest in data ethics, data privacy, compliance, and to be honest with ourselves and with our peers about what that means. Are there certain data sets that we just don't feel like are valid? Are there certain ways that we're measuring that might call into question ethics? We have to be asking those questions of ourselves and our peers and being transparent with those that we're talking to about that. There's also a need to be transparent in our approach to measurement. If we don't feel like we can properly explain the way that we've come to this data and the insights that we've gotten it, let's revisit it. If we hand this off to somebody and say, do exactly what we did, are they going to be able to with the approach that we've laid out and the methodology that we followed? Also, it's about the intent of the measurement. Are we being honest with ourselves about why we're collecting the data in this way? Why we're coming to these conclusions? We need to be really confident that the insights and the learnings that we got from the data are solid and don't have any potential bias. Bias can come from really everywhere. It's our own personal human bias. We also often have client bias where we want our clients to look the best. We just have to be aware of what we're saying to them in terms of that. Sample bias, I think, is something very common of are we talking to the right audience? Are we collecting that data in a non-biased way? So that's it, handing it back over to Ben.
Great. Thank you, everyone. That was a wonderful roundup of the principles. It's really heartening to see, as someone who's been involved in AMEC for so long, to kind of see that evolution and where we were and where we are now. And I think it really is a true reflection of just how much the communications and public relations industry has changed, just how far our specific discipline within measurement and evaluation has come. And I'm really excited for these to be circulated, adopted even farther and wider than they are now, and to really help organizations out there put it into practice. Of course, the principles that we just ran through today, we're a labor of love of this committee, but we also worked with our industry partners to ensure that we receive their input to these principles to make sure they truly reflect the world in which we live and operate today. So I just on behalf of AMEC and everyone on the committee, would like to thank all of our strategic partners from the CIPR, to ECO, the IPR, the PRCA, PRSA, and the PR Academy. Many thanks to all of you. And again, a special thanks to Professor Jim McNamara for his contributions as well to the principles, and of course, to Jonna Burke and to Richard Bagnall. We've already circulated and shared the principles with those partners and have received fantastic feedback and endorsements for everyone, from Francis Ingham, who's been a wonderful partner, from Miko, who's been a wonderful partner to AMEC over the years. And it's really heartening to see how they've been received. And of course, over to you, Nicole, to thank the full committee, all of whom have been taking part in this the last several weeks.
On behalf of the board, Ben and I would really like to thank this committee You'll see names here that go beyond just those who presented today, from meeting in person to gathering information from around the globe, different sectors, agencies, nonprofit, in-house, technology, really working to make sure we had these as inclusive as possible. These people donated their time. So thank you so much on behalf of AMEC, and thank you for creating the Barcelona Principles 3.0.
And with that, we open it up to everyone on the line to have a discussion and ask any questions.
All right, if I'm in the Q&A, it looks like we have a question from Durgesh. If goals are not static and can be changed throughout, how do you take care of evaluation phase? Wouldn't it mean going back to content again and again as you're doing analysis parallelly?
I can take that one. So what we recommend in terms of goals is checking on them throughout the year. So not waiting until December of the end of the year to look at your progress and say, oh, well, we surpassed this goal in March and we didn't even really realize it. So I do think that for goals, you should be checking in on them throughout the year, either every month or at least every quarter, to make sure that you are on track, that you are collecting the data in the best way to measure that goal, and then to reassess. I also think that, it's our job to be mindful of what's going on in the landscape, in the world, with your key audiences, so that you can look back at your goal and say, well, is reaching this audience truly the right goal for us, or should we switch up our audience based on whatever research is out there? So while not every goal is going to change, it's important for us to do periodic check-ins on those goals, on our stakeholders, and making sure that we're still on track, or if we need to reassess. Does that answer your question?
Yes, he said it does.
Okay, perfect.
Another question really gets at what we see as the biggest change or difference for these principles, as some of them might seem to be smaller changes. And I think, and we can definitely, I would love other people to discuss this as well. I think when we were coming out of 2015, we really do see this as a refresh. Some of them aren't drastic because these were rooted from the very beginning in some key and core principles. But what we do know, as communications changes and shifts over time, we do need to make it more holistic, and we need to be aware that we're hitting all the channels that we can, that our audience is listening to our communications and our messaging, all the channels that we use in our programming. It's also important to update it as new data becomes available, and we have the ability to analyze and provide more and more context over time. So I think the biggest change is really recognizing how holistic communications has become and how integrated our data and measurement needs to be. I don't know if anyone else would like to add on to that. Okay. Next question comes from Stuart. Principle 2 makes no reference to outtakes, which makes sense for the actual principle as it is too confusing, but shouldn't they be referenced under what to do?
I'm happy to take that one. So I think in our opinion, the outtakes, so basically what does the consumer do with the content that is put out? So do they engage with it? Does it change their behavior? I think those could really be split up into the output and outcome bucket. So instead of making it its own standalone element, I think we just folded that into the outcome and the output. So let's say the consumer engages with it, shares it, for example, an article online, that would fall into one bucket in the output bucket, or if they change their behavior and all of that, that would then fall in the outcome bucket. So I think that's why we didn't specify that separately.
I'd also say, in the integrated framework that can be found online, there are outtakes, there's outputs, there's outcomes very clearly defined there. I think we have noticed that regionally, sometimes certain terminology helps make more sense in some areas than others. So I would say really look at the principles as they come through from the theory, look at that integrated framework, and see what makes the most sense for you, as the integrated framework does provide a lot of examples of data, and as Kat mentioned, really think through which bucket those fall into. Emily, I believe this next one's going to be for you. How could you showcase the value of communications, ROI, to management in dollars? So typically people who use AVEs say this helps them justify the value of PR in dollar terms, which they understand. And I know this is hard, so sorry to put you on the spot.
This is my favorite question. I could talk about this all day long. Yeah, we hear you, and it's a great question, and that is a real pain point. And I wish I had a single easy answer for that. But what I would say is, just because you need a metric with a dollar sign doesn't mean that we should be using bad metrics with dollar signs, unfortunately, just to fill that gap. Communications really isn't a volume play. It's not about total quantity of impressions, and that's it. If we evaluate it like that, it will never compete with paid media, because paid media, you can blast out as many impressions as you want all the time. So looking at measures that are strictly quant to measure communications is never going to account for what communications actually does best, which is a certain credibility and impact. So there really is no simple one metric answer for PR ROI, but what we advocate is a much more nuanced and thoughtful performance evaluation that accounts for both quality and quantity measures, and really is able to contextualize these in terms of the broader strategy and what it is that you're trying to achieve.
Do you have any views on cost per thousand reached, Emily?
So I think I would say that the answer there is going to be a little bit similar. Cost per thousand reach. Number one, you're going to have a hard time probably coming up with your cost there if it's not truly paid media, right? How do you sort of associate that to your per thousand reach outside of a gigantic aggregate metric? But again, it's that measure is still relying very heavily on just number of impressions or number of reach. And treating it as a volume play, which doesn't really account for the wonderful impact and credibility that we're able to get through with communications that really does change people's minds and behaviors in a way that a lot of paid media just doesn't.
Great. So the next one is the what to do on Principle 6 doesn't make any reference to attribution in relation to outcomes and impact, which will be a client/employer question if you're measuring holistically. I'll let Bailey answer this, but I will say if you look at the integrated framework, we do have that as one of the impact metrics. I think as a principal, Bailey referenced a lot of the outcomes that we can be looking at. But Bailey, do you have any addition there?
Yep. So certainly in the principle itself, it's difficult to put it all in there, but we do have in the what to do, how to go beyond those vanity metrics and get further down the audience journey, which is the outcomes and of course the impact. So a few examples of that include, conversion, whether that's on a website, perception and attitudinal change, whether through a survey, indication of consideration in a product or changing behavior, and then of course purchase intent if purchase is important. And I think really this principle is meant to recognize that you should be including all of those channels, but then using other principles to figure out how to measure down the funnel of those channels based on your audience journey. So hopefully that answers the question. Certainly up for interpretation, but in the what to do should help on that one.
Great. And then this could be for a few of us, but Colin wants to know, what were the biggest challenges in trying to refine the previous principles? And what did the team have to debate the most? I could tell you there were some definite moments around the table where we all had some debates over even just one word. So if anyone would like to share any of those, I'm sure the group would love to hear them.
I can jump in. I think something that we all debated is actually something that a lot of the people are asking about, which is outcomes, outputs, outtakes, impact, and the definition of all of those words. I think we all use those words in different ways, and often they kind of mean the same thing, but there are some key differentiators. So I would say that around the table, we all were able to share our point of view on what those words mean, how we would measure those things. And I think really what the takeaway is that it's up to interpretation, and it's up for us as researchers to help define what those are and how specifically we're looking at them within our own communication goals and with our clients, because it's not clear. There are a lot of buzzwords floating around, and we just have to be really consistent with the way that we're using those terms.
And I think it allowed us to all go to the integrated framework and see the definitions there and realize that we pretty much all agreed. We were just thinking a little differently. So I think the principles and the framework allow us to have strong definitions that then we could see what makes the most sense for each of our organizations within that. I'd also say we all sometimes would get a little impatient in the way that we wanted to push things forward and integrated and holistic and let's throw it all in there. And I think we had to recognize that on the spectrum of measurement and evaluation, we really have to make sure that these principles can be used by everyone who's just getting started and also people who might be further along on the maturity map. So there was a lot of debate there on what language can we use that would let people who maybe are a little more mature on that map versus people who might be just getting started. How can we be helpful for everyone? How can we provide some transparency for everybody and make sure that we have a central point of truth for measurement moving forward?
Yeah, and I think just to build off that slightly, Nicole, there was, I remember a bit of debate or at least discussion around, I think, the channels and kind of what are in and out of the remit of PR and communications and just how much that has changed. And I think we all came to the realization just how many different disciplines are now intersecting with each other. So I think, a lot of agencies where we all sit today are now having to activate, across paid media, across digital media, making use of own channels, thinking about developing, microsites and other digital properties for their clients. So I think it was, again, as you were alluding to, how to incorporate all that into the principles, which requires us to be comprehensive and holistic in our thinking, while also recognizing that for these principles to be, the need for them to be universally usable and easy to digest across the globe, just recognizing just how, whilst in many markets we feel quite advanced and are doing a lot of that cross-channel stuff, and others, some of these, activating on those and using the analytics as behind those activations might not be. So I think there was a bit of not debate, but just how do we reconcile that and make sure that we are serving all purposes for all people as best we can.
We have another question about how do the update and the refresh of these principles affect the measurement framework. And I think that the framework was built and translated in many languages and really thought through that as the principles change, the framework is flexible. However, if you go through the taxonomy in the framework, if you look everything in there, there's lists and lists of examples of what goals are and objectives are, lists of what those inputs might be, outputs, outtakes, outcomes, insights, and impact. So I think, is it going to shift it? No, I think maybe how you approach the framework and the questions that you ask as you come into it, that might change. And I think over time, we're always looking to update the framework as needed. So if new available data comes in or new processes, we do look to integrate that. But I would say it's more of how we are approaching that framework might be slightly different as we think about some of these newer and refreshed principles. And then, let's see. So we have a few questions about the tangible examples. We actually, as part of future webinars with AMEC over the next couple of weeks, we will be doing some individual sessions on each principle. And those will allow us to go in depth a bit more and look at some of those tangible examples for each of those principles. This was the unveiling of the principles a little more generally. Hopefully those what to do's did give you a little bit more concrete of what we're speaking about. And then we will be giving some of those in the future webinars. KPIs are often organizational objectives rather than communications based. If communicators are to set their own key strategic goals, won't they need to somehow connect organizational KPIs with their own key strategic goals?
I can start off that one. I think the answer to that is simple, absolutely. So part of the mission of the principles, and particularly principle 1, is certainly a recognition of an alignment with what an organization is trying to achieve. And so our guidance and the intent there is to be very clear about what it is that organization or that business is looking to do over the long term, and being very clear and working through with your client and within your own organization the role that communications then plays in helping to achieve that. And so when you do that, what you have is this nice dynamic between something that is going to be achieved over time, that requires effort from a lot of parts of an organization. And then you as a communicator or a PR professional are then able to select the right measures that show that incremental success relative to that goal over time. So, and as that starts to build, you're then able to kind of see the role and support the way that communications is supporting that broader business objective. So it's that combination, I would say, of really living up to principle 1, using the integrated framework as a way to kind of help with that alignment between the organization and PR communications, and then knowing the right type of measures that you need to have to be tracking on a continuous basis to show that success and that performance.
Definitely. And then we also had a question, did we get any feedback from C-suites as a target audience regarding their acceptance to these principles? And we did reach out to some friends of AMEC. A lot of people on here, we did think through that. So we did get their input, and I think everyone is very aligned on these principles. And I think there was a session yesterday at the summit that really highlighted the way that we need to be connecting better with some of the C-suites is how we then present these principles or this data that comes out of this. So how do we storytell a bit more? So I think that is something that the C-suite is hungry for, is they know that these principles are important, and then how do we implement them in a way that they see these principles coming through in the data that they're receiving. Then finally, for a final question, and we can maybe go through each person, because we're coming up on time, so a nice short statement, but what is the biggest takeaway today for you? So Ben, why don't we start with you?
Oh, on the spot. My biggest takeaway is just that that for something like the Barcelona Principles to continue to be relevant and to be the foundation, they have to be a living and breathing document. So my takeaway is that as we change, it's heartening that the principles and the thinkers in our industry are able to change with it. We're able to evolve the principles to be in step with just how quickly our landscape is changing to remain relevant and useful.
Thank you. Alex, why don't we do you next?
Nicole. I would say my biggest takeaway is a little bit of what we had talked about earlier, which is that these principles need to be useful to PR professionals, to research professionals, to agencies, to in-house, to entry level. And I think that there are so many different interpretations of the language, of the what to do. And at the end of the day, it's very important to be able to reach everybody, to be able to help everybody, and as Ben noted, to be able to move with the research industry.
Amazing. Do you want to go next? Happy to. So yeah, I would definitely build on both of what Alex and Ben said. So I think the flexibility of the framework is really important. So it is a guideline, it is a framework that needs to be then flexibly adapted to every organization or company using it. At the same time, also, again, keep the context in mind. Like the world today looks very different from, let's say, 6 months ago. There has been so much going on and happening in the last couple of months that just also has to be taken into consideration. And yeah, with that in mind, I think that's a key takeaway, to just stay flexible.
Lauren?
I think in all the principles, you sort of, if it wasn't, besides principle one, was explicitly goal setting, like goal setting was mentioned in almost all of them. And I really think it's just like critical that you get those goals set at the beginning and you get organizational buy-in, because that's going to really help you demonstrate success and help you actually tell the story of success throughout. Like if you bring it back, our goal was to do this and this is how we completed it. Once that's set at the beginning, it makes your life just so much easier.
Thank you. Haley?
Yeah, and I think,
go ahead.
oh,
Sorry, I misheard.
go ahead, Emily. Heard a
Oh,
Y,
I was just, apologies. I was just saying that I think for me, it was really that knowing and being honest about what data doesn't tell us is as important as what it does tell us. And that even in some cases where we may not have a simple and perfect solution to some of even the most burning questions, I think that the best way that we can move forward with integrity is to honestly evaluate what we can know, what it does tell us, and work from there.
Haley?
Sure. So I think this echoes what a few people have said, but in rewriting these principles and the journey we took, it's always humbling for me to realize that everyone and every company and every organization is at a different stop of their measurement journey. And these principles have to apply to whether you're, a beginning organization and just trying to figure out your reach to new audiences, to someone that needs to, measure attribution and get down to sales conversion. And so it's always helpful to get feedback and hear from everyone about how these can still be applicable to so many different situations. So that's always been a learning opportunity for me, and hopefully, seeing how these can apply in different situations as we go from here will be exciting.
Thank you. And to echo everyone, I think the biggest takeaway for me is we are constantly striving for change. When we stop changing and adapting is when we have a problem. We should be constantly changing, and we hopefully will be seeing a refresh of these again in a couple of years or so. But I also think it's important, and it's a lot of the debate we had was how important context is and storytelling is. So as Oren was saying, setting those goals so you can make sure you're telling the right story back to the organization, using the right data so you can really justify and prove some of the insights that you're making, I think is critical. And I think a lot of the small changes you saw in some of these was about making sure that you're pulling in the right data from the right place to be able to tell that story. So I believe that is it. Jonna, anything from you?
Hey, Nicole. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Please join me in a chat round of applause for all of our committee. I mean, I think the appreciation that we lack in the context is the great debate that went on, and in coordinating with our strategic partners and in really putting some rigor behind how these are going to be adopted and accepted into the market for this refresh. So thank you all so much for all of your work, the labor of love that you did. And this is being recorded, and we all heard Nicole that she's ready to do this in a couple of years again. So careful what you say on video. But in seriousness, the principles are never meant to be exhaustive, but to really lay that good foundation for everyone. And we are so thankful for the input and the community that we have that makes this a priority and really helps to give that feedback so they are relevant. So you can take this to your CEO, you can take this to your team internally and have those same internal discussions about what makes the most sense for you and your organization. And I love the points about, always be flexible. We talk so often about data that you used yesterday may no longer be relevant in today's world because of how things are shifting. And so understanding how that works and what your sourcing is and how you're going to get that is so critical. And that's why we like to think that AMEC is a good strategic partner for everyone in making sure that we keep these refreshed and timely and relevant so that as you're having those conversations, it is something that you're giving feedback and having that confidence all along the way. I want to thank everybody on the steering committee once again, and a special thanks to David Rockland, who isn't here, for really being that voice of reason as he's carried these through since the inception in 2010. We'd be remiss if we didn't give him a special round of applause and a special thanks for his leadership along the way. And thank you everyone for joining us on the webinar. I think this is a testament to the importance of these principles, where they are in the kind of ecosystem of good measurement and evaluation. And we're so thankful for all of you being here and being good advocates of Barcelona Principles and also being champions of them publicly. We have posted the link to the presentation that's already on the website and the updated infographic that you'll see on the amecorg.com as well. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you to the steering committee. Thank you to David Rockland, and thank you for joining us. If you didn't attend the summit for the first 2 days, please know that you can still register. There are still upcoming live sessions, and you would also have the on-demand sessions from the first 2 days. So thank you for being part of the community. Thank you for always looking to push yourselves into learning. We appreciate you all. And until next time, I'm Jonna Burke, the Global Managing Director of AMEC. Thank you for being with us.